I'm not a very motivated person. That's the kind of statement that a lot of my inbound personal training clients tell me when they're describing themselves, when we're going through our onboarding process. Other things would be when it comes to exercise, a little bit more specific. When it comes to exercise, I just have no motivation. And I've been doing this for 12 years now, and that statement that kind of statement has never really rung true for me. It's never felt valid. It doesn't feel like a lie, and there's a big difference. It just feels inaccurate. And I worry, in fact, I know sometimes that people are setting themselves up to fail at a health and fitness goal because of that kind of framing before it's even started. So let's really explore motivation, what it actually is, how it actually works, and how you can harness it to achieve your goals. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean. Let's look at that scenario, the inbound personal training client or somebody I'm having a conversation with about beginning a coaching program is telling me about their lack of motivation. But how did that scenario come about? They've contacted me, they've reached out for help or to learn more about my service. So that already shows that there is a desire for change. Motivation is present. So for that reason, I think we should make a big distinction between motivation and momentum. Because whenever there's a desire for change, there is motivation. Now, of course, at first glance, this can sound like semantics or even being a little bit pedantic with how we frame words and statements, but it goes deeper than that. Because saying something like, I am not a motivated person or I have no motivation, that's what we might consider an identity statement. That's a statement that you're telling yourself about yourself, and that can have consequences. When really what you want to be speaking about is the current state of affairs or the current state of momentum or the current state of action or behavior, because all of that can change and it can change in an instant. And this is why positive affirmations can be so powerful. You see, when you say things like, I am not a motivated person, you're giving yourself an identity, and the subconscious mind is going to take that as truth. It doesn't get to decipher whether that's an empowering statement or not. It just takes it as truth. So if you walk around with the identity that you've given yourself, or even worse, somebody else has given you about your ability to act in a motivated way or be a motivated person, that's going to be really disempowering. What you want to speak about really is that you have no momentum. So a better statement would be, I'm motivated to achieve my goal, but I currently don't have momentum. And there's so many ways that you can change that. But a disempowering identity, like I'm not a motivated person, is going to be so much harder to correct. And it's also going to bleed into other areas of life. So when it comes to creating a positive affirmation, this could be something as easy as every day I take actions that bring me closer and closer to my health and fitness goal. As simple as that. And that is a statement that is going to go into your subconscious mind, and it's going to be congruent with what you're trying to achieve. If you're telling yourself that you don't have motivation, that's going to work in the opposite direction. Motivation then isn't an identity, it's an emotional state, which means it's impermanent and can be managed, giving you back power. And motivation isn't something that you're either born with or not, or have or don't have at different times in your life. It's a calculation that your brain is running constantly. It's really the perception between how you perceive or how your brain perceives things are now and the distance between that and where you'd like them to be. So if we take it back to that conversation with me, a personal trainer, what's actually happened there is that for whatever reason, or based on an automatic calculation, your brain has become uncomfortable with the current state of affairs and you'd like to get to the new state of affairs. So the act of seeking counsel or advice from a personal trainer is your way or your first step of action towards traversing that distance. So generally speaking, there are two types of motivation. So one is the affirmative or the positive, the desire to move towards something positive that feels good, that's achievement oriented. So examples would be the desire to feel more confident, the desire to get a six-pack, the desire to complete a 5K, the desire to have more energy. And then the other side of that is the desire to move away from something that's displeasurable or uncomfortable. So that might be something like the desire to stop feeling self-conscious, or the desire to avoid feeling like missed opportunities, the desire to, or the fear of missing out on being able to play sports with grandchildren in the garden, something that could be further away. It doesn't have to be very close by. It doesn't have to be a short-term goal. So this is the way motivation is working, and these calculations are being run by us all automatically all the time. To be clear then, the extent to which your brain registers distance between where you are and where you want to be or don't want to be will be the extent to which you feel motivated. Now, whether you can turn that into actual results would be dependent on your ability to take consistent action, which is what I mean by the differentiator or the line between motivation and momentum. So now that we know motivation is essentially a calculation that's always running and it's always going to be there for good or for bad, what can we do to influence that? What can we do to harness the power of motivation? And what can we do, now that we understand it, to really help us fuel the pursuit of our goals? So if we know that these calculations of motivation are running the whole time, one of the things that we can do to influence that calculation or to stack that calculation in our own favor is really to raise our standards. So this is going through a process of personal development, self-help, and just raising what you expect from yourself on a daily basis. So if you're comfortable with not exercising very regularly, not eating very well, those kind of things, and just not feeling great, there's no judgment in that. It's just that if that's fine for you, you won't get those sort of internal error commands about the distance between where you want to be and where you are, so you won't feel that motivated. But if you raise your standards in the background, it's almost like a software upgrade you can give yourself, and you can say, well, if I go through this process of personal development and I'm going to demand of myself that I'm going to have some form of activity every day, 3 workouts a week, and I'm going to eat low inflammatory food, for example, then that warning sign or that signal that you're uncomfortable with your current state of affairs is going to trigger a lot sooner if you don't do that, because you're only going to be uncomfortable relative to your standards. So if you raise your standards, you're pretty much guaranteed to feel motivation. That doesn't mean motivation feels positive. It can feel very uncomfortable. But what's positive is the driver for action, because on the other side of all of your actions, that's where the results are. So obviously here I'm going to admit serious health complaints, massive logistical changes that are just outside of your control. That's going to happen to all of us at some stage in our life. But all things being equal, the higher you can keep your daily standards, weekly standards, monthly standards, yearly standards, the more motivation you're going to feel and the more you're going to drive yourself towards taking action. So this process is going to require a lot of self-examination. It's going to require an uncomfortable amount of honesty with ourselves, because what we are right now, again, taking into account life's curveballs, what we are right now is the product of what we've been comfortable with over a period of time, or perhaps more accurately, what we haven't been uncomfortable enough with. And we all know personally where we are on that continuum, and it's always a good idea to sit and think about that, because if you can come out of that consideration with higher standards, you'll be driven into action. So one of the most powerful psychological concepts you can utilize to help drive you forward is that of modeling. And you can model behavior, you can model track history, you can model action, and it really helps create a pathway for you to achieve your goals, whether that's business, relationships, or indeed, as we're speaking about, in health and fitness. But you have to be careful. You have to model you have to choose the right models, essentially. Before we start talking about what modeling is and how it works, one of the things you really need to avoid is making sure that you are not running comparisons with social media, because your health and fitness journey is just that. It's your health and fitness journey. The comparison should only be with yourself and where you used to be and where you would like to be. If you're comparing yourself to somebody else's highly curated best on your day-to-day worst, there's just no fruit in that pursuit. There's no fruit there, so avoid that at all costs. So having said that, modeling somebody who's achieved what you would like to achieve and who started from a position similar to yours, or perhaps even logistically or fundamentally worse off than you're starting, is one of the most powerful ways that you can forge your path to success. Because if they've done it, that means it's possible. We always talk about Roger Bannister and the 4-minute mile. Once Roger Bannister beat the 4-minute mile time, and it was perceived to be impossible. Once that had happened, then many other athletes beat that same time, within the next 12 months, because it was seen to be possible. So if you can find somebody who's started where you started in a similar position and is now where you want to be, that's a very powerful motivator, because that gives you faith. You know it's possible. So whether it's possible for you has already been answered. Whether you achieve it or not is just your ability to create the right journey, the right path, the right steps, and consistently take those without giving up. There's no more leap of faith. It's already been achieved by somebody similar to you, so you can do it as well. And this is why before and afters are so powerful in the health and fitness industry. If you can see pictures of somebody that started off similar to you, similar body type, similar level of conditioning, similar story, if you get to read about them, and they've come out looking how you'd like to come out, then you know it's possible. You can use that same modeling in any area of life. Look at somebody who has the relationship you want. Look at somebody who has the education you want. Look at somebody who has the business you want. Look at somebody who's just as happy or as confident as you'd like to be. And then figure out what they've done. As long as you can relate to some of the fundamentals or some of the, parts of their journey that are similar to yours, you can have all of that as well. It's just a case of modeling that behavior, following through on the action. So that's how we would harness some positive elements of psychology. We can also harness negative elements of psychology. First of all, our brains are wired up for survival, which means that we perceive threats everywhere. We work out what's a threat and we try to avoid it, because threats can easily become worse and become existential threats, and at that point the game's over. It just makes sense that has to be weighed heavier than self-actualization or fulfillment, even happiness, because you can live another day and try to achieve that later. But if you're in a fight or flight state or a life, sort of an existential threat scenario, you have to get out of that. So that's what our brain prioritizes, and it makes sense to do so because it means that we can live to die another day, to keep playing the game. So how does that apply to health and fitness? The unfortunate element here is that sometimes we can perceive that distance of where we are to where we want to be as such a distance that it's actually going to be more painful to try to cross that distance than the benefit of actually being on the other side of that. Does that make sense? That can also be made much worse if you've gone through multiple periods of trying health and fitness programs, trying dieting, being restrictive, being in low energy, and getting even some relatively serious health complaints from being on low calories, which is often the journey inbound clients I meet have been on. At the end of the goal, that should all feel great. But because multiple failed attempts have been so extreme and so restrictive in the past, the brain is registering that journey to be more painful than actually how good it would feel on the other side. And that's a real shame. But we can do something about that. And actually, before we talk about what we can do about it, this actually applies to people who are new to fitness as well, because there are a lot of unknowns, and sometimes unknowns can be weighed as serious threats. If you don't want to be embarrassed in the gym, if you don't want to fail at something. So you can see how sometimes the barrier to exercise makes sense. So what can we do about lowering that barrier? So first of all, you want to lower the barrier to entry. You want to make sure that you're starting off nice and light in a well-calibrated fashion that allows you to actually recover from what you're trying to do. This way you can constantly keep convincing your brain that the opportunity of what you're about to work towards achieving on the other side is greater and more powerful than the threat of the hardship of going through the program. So this is why it would make sense to start out with light exercise, short workouts, brisk walks, because this is all positive action and it's not painful action. You don't want to go into big drives of restriction and over exercise. If you went from a standing start to low calories and going out for jogs every day, it's obviously going to feel painful. It's going to feel like a threat scenario. So it's only going to be sustained for very short periods of time, unless you're so driven that what you're driving towards at the other end of the goal is more powerful than how bad all of that feels. And that takes a very curated sense of personal development, but it's also not the most linear route to go. It's not necessarily true, and often it's very much not true, that the harder you work out, the more results you're going to get. So it's about knowing yourself here as well. You have to broker a deal with yourself. How hard am I willing to work without it being detrimental? How much discomfort am I willing to go through while still believing that the over-ending or the overarching goal is more pleasurable than the discomfort I'm going through at the moment? This is why you really stand to benefit from working with a personal trainer or a coach, because they can help you put that kind of program together where you're always calibrated so that the wins are more powerful than the perceived losses. The other thing you can do here is to raise your level of education. Say, for example, even if you exercise 3 times a week, but you do it at 7 o'clock in the morning, but then you have a 10, 12-hour day seated while you're pursuing your career or your business, and then you learn that that workout is great, but it doesn't necessarily offset that sedentary part of the day. What are you going to do with that information? So you're going to get uncomfortable with being sedentary quicker than you would have when you thought that workout was enough. That workout is great. By all means, don't stop that workout. But over a course of time, there will come a time when your brain is going to say, listen, you've been inactive too frequently for too long. We have to broker a deal. We have to renegotiate your lifestyle. And that's the kind of education that can allow you to renegotiate with yourself in a time of wellness, rather than getting a shot across the bow, getting a health risk, and it's forced upon you. Most of us are so reactive when it comes to our health and fitness that we act when we have to act. But when we have to act, it's because that comfort level has reached such a point that it's extreme. But if you can use this psychology and this education to raise your standards, lower the barrier to entry, and also educate yourself to the point that you know what the minimum viable dose is of activity and exercise and mobility and movement and nutrition, you've got the full picture. You're so much better equipped to protect your health than before you knew any of that. And that motivation then is just working for you. It's uncomfortable, but it's working for you, and you get to stay well. So how do we make a change between motivation and momentum? So really I think it's an opportunity to create another one of these mental models where, reframing the way we approach health and fitness. Really, it's really trying to establish the fact that it's going to be consistency that wins the day. So small acts, consistent acts of movement, exercise, good eating, and rest and recovery, those are what win the day. You don't need to go on a restrictive diet plan if you eat well for a year, because you'll be at a healthy weight. You'll be at the level of body fat you want to be. There was no need to ever diet. It was short-term thinking. There's no need to over-exercise and jump into a highly intensive program where you're training daily at that level, and perhaps certainly in combination with a restricted diet you can't recover from. You don't need to do that. So think of it like a plane taking off. This transition between motivation is that, we're going to use these psychological principles that we've just discussed to really drive up motivation. So if we can get motivation firing, we can really think about our goal, think about what we want to achieve, and use these psychological principles to make our brains perceive the distance as something we need to act on right now. Then it's like being in the plane, isn't it? It's like the engine's firing. You're about to shoot down the runway. With all of these things are moving the objects out of the way, reducing friction, and then you take off. And once you've taken off and you reach that cruising altitude, that's where we are able to fall back on consistency, minimum viable stimulus, minimum effective dose. And then, all it takes from that is a fraction of the energy it took to take off, to lift off, because you have your momentum. So once you achieve your momentum, your cruising altitude, then all it takes is small, consistent effort. And that way you build a habit set or a lifestyle framework that doesn't allow you to drop back past this sort of imaginary safety net. If you imagine, all of the losses are when you fall through that net, but your cruising altitude, that small amount of thrust to keep you moving, is going to guarantee that you keep at a healthy weight, keep strong enough, keep fit enough, keep active enough, and really that's where all the benefits are. So now that you're equipped with all of that information, what would the role of a coach be? When you set out your intentions, a coach can consult with you to make sure that you set your standards in a way that are both high enough to drive that motivation, but also be calibrated in such a way that it's not only doable and you're able to recover from it, but it's also the most linear route to what you're trying to achieve. You can have all the motivation in the world, but if you're choosing workouts and a lifestyle plan that ultimately is misinformed or isn't going to work out, you'll only see a fraction of the results that you would have seen had you been on a linear path. The other result, or the other benefit, is accountability. So making sure that you have somebody with oversight, making sure that you're staying accountable to those actions, making sure that that motivation is staying red hot and talking you through the process of education, raising your standards, modeling behavior, and also giving you that faith that you're on the right course. So the ironic thing about motivation is that often the closer you get to your goal, the less motivation you feel. And that's a good thing. That means that the discomfort is gone. Remember, that motivation or that burning desire came from being so uncomfortable with the current state of affairs compared to where they could be that you just had to take action. So the closer you get to where you want to be, the less negative self-talk, the less discomfort, the less pain, the less emotional turmoil you're going through from your current state of affairs, which is fantastic. But it doesn't mean that the goal is achieved. So what can we do to offset that? If you start out at 30% body fat and your goal is to get to 10% body fat, you're going to be more motivated at, say, 24% body fat than you will at 11. Because at 24% body fat, you've seen some progress, you know things are working, but you're still really uncomfortable with where you currently are and still see where you want to be as, you know, the burning desire. But at 11% body fat, at a 10% body fat goal, you can imagine that you're getting 90 or 95% of the real world benefits. Your self-talk is much more positive. People are telling you look great and you're just closing in on that goal. It's at that point where you can have a bit of a bounce back, which means that you pull your foot off the gas. You take your foot off the accelerator because you're so close to being where you want it to be. And often you thought you needed to be at 10% to get all of those benefits. Maybe you already had those psychological and real world benefits at 14%, for example, which is often the case. So what can you do about that? What you can do is set that goal a little bit short of where you want to be, or a little bit long, of where you want to be. So if you want to be at 10% body fat, set a 9% body fat goal. Sounds silly, but it really works because you want to just make sure that where you actually want to be is achieved before you suffer that loss in motivation. There are some other things you can do though. So another thing that you can do is create a reward system. And this is probably a little bit more powerful because you're introducing another motivator. So, okay, that same analogy, that same example, at 11% body fat on a 10% body fat goal, there's no real motivation for that extra 1% body fat because you have all of the benefits of the results. So you introduce an external reward. You say, okay, at 10% or at 9.9%, what I'll do is I'll give myself a trip, or I'll give myself a reward. I'll buy myself something. I'll indulge in something. Maybe not something nutritional because that might not make sense, but that reward mechanism is a new motivator and it's going to get you across that finish line because your first motivator has weaned because you're no longer in discomfort. So the sum of all these actions every day is either going to add up to take you closer to where you want to be or further away from where you want to be. So if you can live a certain lifestyle that just means that you never have 2 days in a row that take you further away from where you want to be, then you've pretty much guaranteed your success through momentum and consistency. So I think you can see now that you already are a motivated person. So what's left to do here is take a look at your level of action or inaction to see and calibrate how motivated you are to make changes in a given direction. Then harness everything we've discussed to put a strategy in place, put a plan in place, and consistently execute it. And you'll make that long-term transition from motivation to momentum. Thank you. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like me to help take the guesswork out of your health and fitness pursuits, please visit my website and book your free consultation where we'll discuss my online personal training service.